We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. Now, we're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, also long-time host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. We've been talking polls, we've been talking the general feel of the campaigns. But now I want to get into my favorite bit, Tim, and that's historical counterpoints or historical elements that we can look to perhaps try and parse and figure out what's happening today. Now, we did discuss earlier Kellyanne Conway, superb analyst in terms of these things, and what she's calling the narrow landslide, which, as we mentioned off camera, a lot of other pollsters and news people are calling a limited landslide because they don't want to give Kellyanne Conway credit where credit's due for terming this. But based on the polling, Tim, it does seem that if the election were held today, on the day of recording, and the polls were accurate, Trump would win with around 293 electoral college votes, 23 above the required 270. But I want to talk about what kind of pictures we've seen in the past. And the one that springs to my mind, I don't see, if Trump does win, and I'm not making any predictions here, but if he does win, I don't see anywhere near a Reagan-style victory. But I can perhaps give credit to a George H.W. Bush landslide. What's your take?
Well, George H.W. Bush probably gets overlooked in the landslide territory because he did win 406 electoral votes in his race against perhaps the most pathetic candidate of modern times, Michael Dukakis, who basically stuck a stake through his own heart when he put on an oversized helmet and drove around in a tank. And you knew at that moment that the election was over. That was a moment. And from there, it was clear that Dukakis was going to lose. Bush was going to win by default, largely because of Dukakis's weakness, but also because he effectively served the third term of Ronald Reagan's presidency. He didn't win on his own merit so much as the popularity of the man who had picked him to become vice president. I actually look at this a little bit more like 1980, not in the sense that Donald Trump's going to win 45 states or 44 states like Ronald Reagan did, but because of the late-breaking vote. For all the talk of how everybody's chosen up sides and they've already made their decision on the 2024 election, estimates, reasoned estimates are that anywhere from 10 to 15% of the public is still not absolutely sure of how they're going to vote. They're either totally undecided or they're leaning one way or the other, but they haven't fully decided who they're going to vote for or whether they're even going to vote at all. And it was those late-breaking voters in 1980 that turned a tight race into a landslide. What happened was that the polls between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and people under the age of 50, 55 won't remember this because it was 44 years ago, but that race was pretty much a dead heat through October, according to the polls. And in fairness to the polls and the pollsters, they could not pick up the wave towards Reagan at the last minute when people decided, I just can't take 4 more years of Jimmy Carter. And people could say, well, Ronald Reagan was a happy warrior. He was one of the greatest politicians, if not presidents of all time. But let's recall that in 1980, there was no conservative talk radio. There was no Fox News. There were very few newspapers that were not run by a liberal elite or had endorsed Carter or refused to endorse Reagan at the very least. So he didn't have the kind of social media presence, for example, that Donald Trump has now to push back against the charges against him. And yet, in the end, Jimmy Carter, a person people liked, actually personally liked, but felt was a weak president. In the end, the question was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That was in the single debate between Reagan and Carter just days before that election. And it crystallized the voters, and that undecided swath of voters all went heavily towards the challenger. Now, history shows that in races that are close to the end, that generally, and this is not a blanket rule, but generally they break towards the challenger, not towards the incumbent. So I think the people that are still on the fence, and look, 10 to 15% could be 10 to 15 million voters. They're going to ask themselves, do I want 4 more years of this? Which it seems to me that could provide a big bump to Trump. I don't see where Trump really opens the possibility of a stampede towards Kamala Harris.
I think that the polling actually validates your point there, Tim. You talked about how it was very much a neck and neck race towards the end, and then there was the undecided vote that came out. And it's been a Kamala Harris race since she got on the ballot. It was Kamala Harris's race to lose. But now we're getting down to the last couple of days, and the polls are swinging towards Donald Trump. He's got a national lead. He's got a lead in all 7 battlegrounds, depending on how you pass it. And the momentum for this upswing for Donald Trump is quite heavy, especially on the betting markets. The betting markets are 63%, I believe, at the time of recording in favor of Donald Trump win, and 30-something% in favor of Kamala Harris won. That, when you say it's 60-something, people tend to think, well, that's only like 10 to 13% more betting, but it's not. It's the division between the two. That's a big division. And
it's
so
a gulf at this point.
It really is. And so what you have is you've got this late breaking swing. So where is that coming from? Because at time of recording, almost 50 million early votes mixed between ballots returned or early in-person voting have been cast. And yet the polls are still swinging towards Donald Trump. So that makes me think that you might be onto something with that undecided late breaking vote, Tim. There's another election I want to bring to mind, and that is the Dewey and Truman election of 1948. Tell me if I'm wrong on that, 48?
Well, believe it or not, I wasn't alive then. But the history books reported as 1948, yes.
Right.
And I'll tell you what, in that race, the 50 national reporters who covered the Truman-Dewey race were so convinced that Thomas Dewey, then the governor of New York, was going to win that they didn't even bother to cover the last couple of weeks of the campaign. It was every single prognosticator and pollster were predicting not just a Dewey victory, but a decisive Dewey victory. And in fact, Harry Truman won decisively. You see the old famous Chicago headline saying Dewey beats Truman, with Truman gleefully holding that up to show how wrong they were. And I think that was the beginning of the question of how accurate are polls? How much can we trust them? How trustworthy are they?
Yeah, the thing that really stands out to me is that was the very start of what they call the whistle stop tours, wasn't it? And it was quite literally, it was Harry Truman on the back of a train with the whistle going to tell people to come to the station and listen.
I think it was the most brilliant campaign strategy until Donald Trump went to McDonald's. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but the whistle stop was absolutely brilliant because it showed that he connected directly to real people in small towns and large. And it was so efficient because he didn't have to get off the train, get set up in a hotel, make a bunch of speeches to bigwigs. He just connected with ordinary folk in one town after another. And once again, like in 1980, the polls couldn't pick that up. And it's hard to pick up a late-breaking vibe or a late-breaking stampede to one candidate or the other, in fairness to pollsters.
Absolutely right. Just one interesting fact there. I think it was Dewey's eldest son who accused Truman of blackguarding around the country, trying to rally people up, and they thought it was below them to do such antics. And then,
well, the irony about that campaign too was that Thomas Dewey acted like the incumbent. He just sat around. He didn't do much. He had sort of a presidential front porch campaign where he basically brought people in to meet with him and kiss the ring, while Truman, who was the actual incumbent, ground his way across the country like some sort of an upstart, even though he was a sitting president of the United States. So you had a real reversal of roles there.
Yeah, the similarities to today are quite something. We're going to be back with Tim Donner to ask, what will the country look like after Election Day? Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.